Every 3 months, my wife Shira and I receive a failing grade as good citizens. Every quarter, whether we want it or not, and we do not want it, it comes in the mail, the dreaded and terrifying, traumatizing and triggering home energy report of National Grid. The home energy report of National Grid would compare us and our energy use and our energy consumption to that of average neighbors and to that of efficient neighbors. And it's never pretty. It is always ugly. The National Grid Home Energy Report has 3 grades. There is great, represented by a big smiley face. There is good, represented by a small smiling face. And there is the dreaded, you use more energy than average, represented by a sad, frowning face. Now, every quarter, even though we try, we really do, we always get the sad, small, frowning face, you use more energy than average neighbors. But recently, this came in the mail, and it was a total shocker. Because for the first time ever, we got a great big yellow smiling face. So efficient neighbors used 12 therms. I don't know what a therm is. Average neighbors used 42 therms. Y-O-U, we used 7 therms. And we got a great big smiley face, 42% less energy than even efficient neighbors. Well, when I got this, I was just so proud. And when I got this, I said, I've got to bring this to shul on a crowded Saturday morning and just let you know how energy efficient my wife and I are. And just then, we realized there's one small problem with it. There's a catch. And the catch is that it covered a period when we were not living at home at all. This covered a period when we were actually doing an extended Airbnb in the Berkshires. So it wasn't that we used less energy, it was that we used no energy. So the report was lovely, but the catch undoes the lovely report. Beware of a catch that undoes the lovely report. And I was thinking about our sad National Grid home energy report story this morning when reading the first aliyah that we read together. Because not only does chapter 5 of Genesis provide a lovely teaching, it provides the single most important teaching in all of Judaism, which is that every human life contains infinite human dignity, and every human life contains equal and infinite human dignity because every one of us is created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And the Talmud itself in the tractate Sanhedrin says this, and it says, this is our greatest teaching. And it says, because we're all created by God, nobody can say, my blood is redder than your blood. Because we're all created by God, nobody can say, I have more yichus than you have. Because we're all created by God in the image of God, nobody can say, I am more entitled to life's blessings than you are. It's the most compelling teaching there is. There's just one catch. And the catch is that often the Torah itself ignores this crucial teaching. For example, Exodus 21:2. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and the 7th year he shall go free without payment. Now, wait a minute. If everybody contains equal and infinite dignity, if everybody is made in the image of God, how then does the Torah permit slavery? What about the slave's dignity? Or Deuteronomy 7, Moses tells the Israelites, when you go into Canaan and you dislodge the 7 Canaanite nations that live there, make sure you destroy all of their holiest spaces. This is what you shall do to them. You shall tear down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their sacred posts, and consign their images to the fire. Well, wait a minute. If everybody contains equal and infinite human dignity, if everybody is made in the image of God, why are we owning slaves? And why is the Torah mandating religious warfare? That we're commanded to, by God, in the name of God, to destroy another faith's holiest sites. How do we make sense? It feels like the catch is very inconsistent with the rule. So let's just step back here. We have a contradiction in the Torah itself. On the one hand, the Torah contains nobler angels. The nobler angels is that we are to regard every human being everywhere on the planet as of equal human dignity. Everyone is made by God in the image of God. And then you have other laws that directly contradict that. What's going on? So I'll tell you what the catch is. The catch is that the Torah contains multitudes. The Torah contains noble angels and less noble angels, and they're both true, and they're both in creative tension. And you know why the Torah contains multitudes? Do you know why there is this inner contradiction? And the answer is because we contain multitudes. And we contain this inner contradiction. Ask yourself this question. Who do you really love? And who do you really want to lavish your care on? And who would you do anything for? Who do you just love and you want to give and you want to care for as much as your own very self? So the Torah answers that question. It says, V'ahavta l're'acha kamocha. You shall love your re'ah. I'm going to leave it undefined now. Love your re'ah as much as you love your own self. In other words, there's a category of person you don't want to live. Nobody here wants to live with the following hierarchy. I love me most of all. Like when I look in the mirror, that's what really motivates me, right? Nobody wants to just live for the person in the mirror. Everybody wants to love somebody at least as much as they love themselves, even more than themselves. Otherwise, what kind of life is that, right? So who is it that you're supposed to love so much you love them as much as yourself, maybe even more than yourself? So the Torah says it's a re'ah. So what's a re'ah? So that if you open up a biblical concordance, the Bible uses the word re'ah in 2 senses. Number one, somebody who lives in your zip code. A fellow Newtonian, a fellow Brooklynian, a fellow Greater Bostonian. Somebody who's in your zip code. Or number two, somebody that you really love, you have a lot in common with. You would describe them as a beloved companion. You all actually know this phrase because it's the last phrase. It's in the 7th blessing of the Sheva Brachot. Re'im ahuvim, beloved companions. That's the spouses that just got married. So if they're in your neighborhood, love them like yourself. If they're your beloved companions, love them like yourself. In other words, like people who are like you. And this is human nature. We like people who are like us. We get people who get us. We have empathy for people who have empathy for us. And if you're not like us, and if you don't get us, and if you don't live near us, and if you're other than us, if you're other, not as much. And that's the multitude that the human soul contains. And that's the multitude that's reflected in our holiest Torah. But now, here's the thing. We Americans, of all people, should get this. Because you have the same multitudes in our own national holiest documents, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now that's sublime. That's inspiring. That's beautiful. But there's a catch. When it was written, all men are created equal, did not include women. All men are created equal did not include enslaved people. All men are created equal didn't really include all men. It included all men who are like the framers who wrote it, white, Christian men who own land. And the American project has been about expanding the promise in the Declaration of Independence to include all fellow citizens of our beloved land. And that is the Jewish project too. We humans, we contain multitudes, and our Torah contains multitudes, and it contains a noble voice. Every person possesses infinite dignity and a less noble but very real voice. My zip code, my companion, my neighbor, my beloved, my loved one, but not like the rest of the world. That's just too big, that's just too much. I don't have energy for that. And those multitudes. So how do we help our noble voices and noble angels be ascendant? So I don't know. I don't have the answer to that one. But I can only tell you one thing. If it's going to happen at all, it takes work. If it's going to happen at all, it's only because we're intentional about it. Because if we're not, the default is that we only like people who like us. The default is tribalism. So I want to give you a story, and I want to give you some spiritual homework. The story is of a person who likes people who are not like him. And my spiritual homework for you is, what would your own version of this look like? So this comes from a person who's a professor at the Kennedy School of Government named Arthur Brooks. And he's also a thought leader, and he's written plenty of op-eds and books. Arthur Brooks, he writes a book called Love Your Enemies, right? Because right now we're only loving people who are like us. How do you love somebody who's not only not like us, but love your enemies? That's his title, Love Your Enemies. How do you do that? So he offers up the following hypo. I'm just going to read it. It's a thought experiment. I'm quoting him. I'm going to give you a list of one-sentence demographic identities of 4 people. As you read them, knowing nothing else, form a mental picture and ask yourself what you feel about each person. 1, a Spanish-speaking immigrant woman, raised in poverty in a dictatorship, who comes to America as a young adult and works a minimum wage job. 2, a politically conservative young man from an upper middle-class family who studies at an Ivy League university. 3, a farmhand in rural Idaho who spends his days driving a combine and his free time hunting and fishing. 4, a girl orphaned at birth in a small village in China, who later winds up against all odds living in the United States. And when you first get this hypo, you might think that I will be able to relate to the demographic that's like me. We like people who are like me. And we won't relate so well to the demographics that are not like me. But it turns out Arthur Brooks' hypo has its own happy catch. He concludes, quoting him, It turns out that was a trick question. Those 4 people are my wife of 27 years and our 3 children. Admittedly, we are way out on the tail in intra-family diversity. What do we have in common? Intense love for one another, which is the one thing that ultimately matters. Arthur Brooks married the woman who was born into a small village in China, who was orphaned and who, against all odds, came to America. And he and his wife had the 3 children, who are the Spanish-speaking immigrant woman, the Ivy League grad, and the Idaho farmhand. They are not like each other, but they love each other. What would our own version of that look like? Because if we can figure that one out, then we can take the Torah's most beautiful teaching, most sublime teaching, and hardest teaching because it bumps up against human nature. We can take that teaching out of the pages of a holy parchment and into the world where it's really needed. And that would be, well, that would be religion on its best day. Shabbat Shalom.